already met. Peter is an emeritus professor in Kiel, and all the information about Peter is here. You all read this. But I know Peter for more than 25, 26 years. When I went to Kiel as a new lecturer, Peter was one of the trade union activists in the whole university. So I learned lots from Peter. But also Peter is an expert on African political economy. So hopefully now he will talk about political economy, maybe about Africa too. Peter.
Yeah, I was gonna, well, originally you suggested I talk about Africa. And I thought, well, actually, I ought to try and find an African to sort of talk about Africa. Because for too long, Africa has been the territory of non-Africans. And it's time that, and there are plenty of Africans around, not only in Africa, but also in this country, who can talk about Africa. So I don't want particularly to talk about Africa, although I will mention some countries. I did my PhD research in Tanzania back in the day, in the late 1960s, when Tanzania was just embarking on its socialism and self-reliance project of President Julius Nyerere, and after the Arusha Declaration, which was what was then the Tanganyika African National Union, which was the single party that governed the country. And the Arusha Declaration was a break with a standard post-independence strategy, and was attempting to change the country's economic strategy and political strategy into a more socialist direction. And for a while it looked like it was going to work. But like most socialist experiments, as they're quite often called, they were brought to a fairly quick close essentially because of the conditions of the world economy and the heavy dependency of countries like Tanzania on the situation of the world economy, and particularly on commodity prices. So the global south as a whole, the majority of countries of the global south back in the 1960s were countries that were heavily dependent on the export of primary commodities, of agricultural commodities, like things like coffee and tea, for example, and sometimes corn or maize, and also on minerals, and particularly gold and diamonds and copper and those kind of minerals, and some other precious minerals. Tungsten, and say what I used to say in my seminars when somebody's mobile phone rang. So tell them I'm busy. So that general picture was of countries generally heavily dependent on exports of primary commodities to the world market. And with the with the revenue from that exports, they could then, and the idea was that they would industrialize by importing capital goods, machinery, and equipment, and they would industrialize and economies would grow in that way. They would industrialize, they would employ more and more people, they would become a self-contained market, or they would be able to export some of the products that they were making, which, as we know, became the case in East Asia in particular. Anyway, as I said, I wasn't going to talk about Africa because I think you should get somebody from Africa to talk about Africa. So I'm going to talk about everything else and include Africa a little bit. So, first of all, I think one of the things nowadays that is particularly noticeable about cities and major urban centres of the global south is the contrast between the skyscrapers and the poor housing, if you can call it that. And this you find everywhere. So I'm just going to whiz through these pictures because, you know, as all of us are taught when we were taught to lecture, or in my case not taught to lecture, most of us are, you know, visual aids are very good. So here we have some visual aids, just to get us in the mood. And you have pretty much everywhere you go. I mean, this is, I actually wrote, oh yes, this is Jakarta in Indonesia. And this is Mexico. You see these beautiful apartments, and then behind kind of shanty towns. And then South Korea, even South Korea, which is the success story of East Asia, you still find temporary housing, and you see the satellite dishes on these roofs. And then this kind of urban squalor with water running through. And this is Bangkok, Thailand. And again, you see the way that almost there's a 45-degree split across the screen with poor housing, shacks, and the lower part of the screen, and then very nicely built flats and apartments and houses on the other side of the screen. And this is Shanghai, China. Again, a big contrast with those huge apartment blocks. And South Africa, I like this picture of the golf course on the one side of the hedge, and then the shacks or the shanty towns on the other side. And here we have plastic pollution in Kenya. Now there's a thing that, I mean, you know, I'm talking against the background of dreadful environmental issues around the world. And this is one of them. And it's not about global warming, it's just about the pollution part of that. And incredible, I mean, I was just amazed when I found this picture. And then you've got the industrial side. So here we have aircraft being assembled in Morocco. I could probably have found similar pictures for Brazil. Brazil has a very strong self-standing aircraft industry, although the Americans, I think, are after it. Boeing is after it. But Boeing has its own problems at the moment, as we know. And so you have you have this kind of thing, and then you have people working outside in an industrial yard doing very simple tasks, cutting pipes and so forth. And these run together. And I could probably have found other pictures of, let me just leave that for a minute. What this is, I guess what we kind of term this is uneven and combined development, or combined and uneven development. I'm not quite sure which order it comes in. But it is essentially a feature of world capitalist development anywhere, that you have this very advanced on the one hand and very poor basic on the other, and you can imagine that is also reflected in remuneration from working in these areas. And productivity levels are low in these kind of industrial yards, and productivity levels are high. I mean, there were lots of pictures of factories producing textiles or producing computers, which you can find through the global south. So you have this contrast continually. And as we know from work that was done a long time ago on the informal sector, there is a kind of hierarchy of enterprise, with enterprises some feeding into each other, some not, some producing goods for different sections of the population at very different prices. Okay, well, that's just to kind of picture. And now a bit of theory, and I'm going back to, I've got the advantage of having lived and having been a student in the 1960s, and at the time when there was a lot of optimism about development in developing countries. We call them, there was a big debate, do we call them backward countries, do we call them developing, do we call them underdeveloped? What's the best thing to call them? So we ended up, I think, calling them developing, because that was much more positive. And people were very optimistic about it. And the idea, and because that was a period of time when developed countries, by and large, still enjoy a kind of Keynesian state-led development. Strong state, regulated industrial and agricultural development, and the idea was that, well, developing countries would go the same route. All they needed was a strong state. They didn't have a capitalist class of any significance, so the state would have to do the work of organising capital for investment in the manufacturing industry, which was where they wanted to get to. And investment would come from government, from tax revenue, as much as they could actually get and extract from the population and from enterprise, and then foreign capital. The big thing was to attract foreign capital. So that was the kind of model. But also it was a time when there was a lot of theorizing about what was going wrong. There was a lot of theorizing, particularly coming from Latin America. And the idea of developing countries being heavily dependent on developed countries' economies. They were supplying developed countries with minerals, with agricultural raw materials, and so on. And essentially, because developed countries were in control of those markets, then the underdevelopment that one could observe very easily in developed countries, and the fact that they weren't developing very rapidly, was the consequence of development. So development and underdevelopment are two sides of the same coin, as Andre Gunnar Frank, one of the major theorists of this dependency school, put it. And the other emphasis was on the extraction of surplus. The fact that there was actually economic activity happening in developing countries, but the surplus that was being produced was essentially being exported by the companies that were in control. And even if, as in the Tanzanian case, for example, there was a nationalisation and companies came under state control, they still faced the conditions of the world markets. The conditions of the world markets were highly volatile, as we know. And a lot of the developing countries that we're talking about did not have the kind of mineral resources that they needed, for example, oil, to power their economies. So they needed to import oil. And if if we're looking at timelines, in 1973 there was a massive increase in the oil price from, if I remember rightly, $4 whatever it was, $4 a gallon maybe, to, I can't remember what the unit was now.
Barrel?
Anyway, 4 to 12.
The barrel.
The barrel, thank you. It went from 4 to 12. And then again in 1979, it went from 12 to 13. And then after that, we know steadily, and even now they're talking about it going to 100 because of what's happening in the Middle East. So you've got that degree of volatility, and what it does, of course, is make life very difficult for governments, even if these governments are trying very hard to do to invest in development. And that's another issue of what the governing political classes in these countries are up to. Well, then the thing about 1960s and 1970s was there was this debate about dependency, and there were some studies that were done. There was famously there was an economist called Bill Warren who came out with, who was very against the dependency theory, argued very strongly that the developing countries were developing. He wrote a book. His book was unfortunate. He died before it was published, but it was published by one of his students. He wrote a book, and in this was basically saying, well, look, you know, if you're a proper, in a way, if you're a proper Marxist, then what you should be realizing is that these countries are going to develop. Look what Marx wrote about India. And Marx indeed wrote about India, but he actually wrote two important things about India. One was that the British had effectively destroyed the domestic textile industry in India, which was very much within the boundaries of dependency theory. And so development and underdevelopment are the two sides of the coin. But of course what Marx pointed to was, and what Warren made a big thing about, was the railways. The development of railways would allow all kinds of internal trade to develop, and as a consequence you would have the growth of an industrial capitalist class. You'd be able to use resources to produce them, convert them into industrial products. And then there were other theories about what we came to call eventually the Global South. And one that I particularly remember liking at the time, it made sense to me, was that, of course, there were two kinds of capitalism, two kinds of capital. There was merchant capital, there was industrial capital. Merchant capital was essentially engaged in extracting as much value as possible without really investing to increase productivity. So that this was absolute surplus value, as opposed to relative surplus value, which manufacturing industry, with its mechanization and increasing productivity of workers and so on, would allow capitalists to accumulate in a less primitive way than with absolute. And so his argument was, well, capitalism didn't develop or didn't exploit the underdeveloped countries enough. In other words, the rate of exploitation being, of course, the rate of exploitation and the relative surplus value. which in kind of economic terms you put as a kind of productivity issue that they were not interested in. They were interested in squeezing as much as labour as possible out of workers without actually giving the workers tools to increase productivity, or giving them very few. And that led to a conclusion, almost parallel at the time, which was that, well, socialist development is the answer. And after all, we had examples of socialist development in Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China. That it could be done, and development could take place, and distribution would be more fairly organised, and capitalism won't do that. Socialism won't do that. So it's only through socialist economic development that you will get proper development. Well, some countries have tried that, but as we know from the 1970s, there was globally a shift away from the Keynesian model and back to what we came to call neoliberal, neoclassical economics in particular, but the idea that the way forward is to follow market signals. And surprisingly, market signals suggested that developing countries of the global south should actually concentrate on things in which they have an advantage, so-called comparative advantage. In other words, they should concentrate on exporting the same things they're always exporting, and only engage in industrial production, manufacturing production, where they can compete on world markets. So, in fact, back to a situation which, well, it's not back to, because it always was the case. They were heavily dependent on what was happening in the world market. And this is a world market increasingly controlled by global corporations, which again is an issue. So now, you know, I try to avoid showering you with data, so these are kind of indications of the kind of thing that we were talking about. So, is capitalism developing in the global south? Well, yes and no. Or I should say, is capitalism developing the global south? Yes and no. We get back to combined and uneven development. We look at the data. And if we look at the data, I've taken this indicator of gross domestic product per head because it's a standard indicator. It doesn't tell us something, but it doesn't tell us anything about the real distribution of national income, but it tells us, gives us a kind of indicator of where we are. And see your comment, thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
And so here we are, we have China, which over the period since, say, 1970, I mean, I could pick 1960, but 1970 was as good a year as any. The Chinese GDP per head was $284 a head. These are, if I remember rightly, if I did this correctly, then these are what they call purchasing power dollars. So purchasing power parity dollars is essentially trying to take care of the fact that, let's say, the price of a bowl of rice in Thailand or in China is going to be considerably less than the price of a bowl of rice in the United States. So what you try and do is to bring it down to the dollar value in Thailand. or in China in this particular case. Well, the GDP per head has gone up 41 times in China over that 50-year period. In Nigeria, 1.4 times. Brazil, 2.5 times. South Korea, 17 times. And I thought I'd put Turkey. Sorry, between 1970 and 2022. Now I just pulled these out of the World Development Report, just to show you that that has been, in the case of South Korea, and especially in the case of China. China started from, as you can see, from a very low base. So maybe I should have gone to a later year. 1990. But China started from a low base, but that's the point. It rapidly increased, and particularly, I suspect, after the early 1990s, when Deng Xiaoping came and with his economic reforms, and China started getting foreign investment in a big way and opening up very strongly to the West, but in a very controlled way. So even Turkey, I mean, look at Turkey. Turkey's done.
Why even Turkey? Why even?
Well, given what's been going on in Turkey all this time, but maybe this is also a contributory factor. Anyway, there you go. And then one of the other indicators of development that I quite often like to use is manufacturing exports as a proportion of total exports, because, of course, the point about comparative advantage and the general policies of what came to be known as structural adjustment were that developing countries of the global south should be exporting things in which they have a comparative advantage. Indeed, they have an absolute advantage because they've got raw materials that nobody else has. So concentrate on that, build an economy around that, and forget about trying to industrialize and have big manufacturing, because other countries can do that. Now that's, I mean, I'm oversimplifying it, but it's kind of the way the argument goes. So then you look at, okay, so if they're not supposed to export manufacturers, look at some of them have been doing that. Now you look at China. China was already in 1970 exporting 50% of its exports were manufactured exports. Now they weren't particularly complex manufacturers. They were probably textiles and small machines and things that didn't work very long. Things like that. But they were exporting. In 2022, 93% of China's exports are manufacturing exports. 93%. Which is extraordinary. And of course we know what they are, because you only have to turn over all household goods. Pretty much everything that we buy for the household is made in China. Computers. They are either made or at least assembled. Now we've got motorcars. So, in a way, I mean, this has been an incredible transformation. And if you then compare with other countries, like Nigeria, for example, Nigeria, of course, is being exported oil. So oil is always going to dominate. They've got some manufacturing, and they're moving on manufacturing. But a lot of that manufacturing is very basic. Cement. Nigeria has a cement corporation that it has branches in other countries in Africa, is a real multinational. A real kind of, not a global corporate, but certainly an African multinational. Supplying lots of countries with cement, become a big manufacture of cement. So Nigeria, things are moving. Nigeria, of course, has a big domestic market, but still, only 5% of its manufacturing exports are, of its exports are manufacturing goods. Now look at Turkey. Turkey has gone from 9% to 74%. I have personal experience of this. Because pretty much all the white goods in our house, which I've had to renew recently, in the last 2-3 years, they're all Beko. Beko looks to me as though it's just another version of, what's the big German one?
Bosch.
They look very similar.
No.
You don't think so?
Is that so keen on Turkey? I guess it.
Well, okay, but there you are. I mean, I'm sure Bosch has been involved in the development of Beko. So,
doesn't Turkey do a lot of drones as well now? Having the big drone that they're manufacturing.
Yeah,
everybody's buying it.
Yeah.
Everybody.
So,
all the minibuses in Europe, most of them
are from Turkey. Yeah. There you go. And you look at Brazil. Brazil has pretty much doubled. You look at South Korea, which was already very high.
What does Brazil?
But it's the composition that has changed.
What does Brazil? What's its name?
Well, Brazil makes aircraft.
Oh.
It makes that very nice plane, the EMAR. You've never been. I've actually been in one of those. It's one of those relatively small planes nowadays, but it does a lot of kind of commuting work and short distance travel. What else does Brazil export? I forgot. So there you have the shifting composition towards.
When we hear that so in China, for example, we've got 93% manufacturing exports. How much of that is actually foreign owned? So it's like almost like what's actually is there to some extent what's happening is that companies that used to be exporting manufactured goods from the West just sort of upped and put their stuff in China.
A lot of the companies are Chinese.
Chinese.
Yeah, a lot of the companies are Chinese. Of course, they may manufacture under license, which I'm sure they do. But of course, once you start doing that,
it doesn't matter.
Then you're learning by doing. You're learning all kinds of things, and you can replace. I mean, China is now heavily into electric car manufacturing, and they're going to flood us with electric cars, and they're going to be cheap. As long as they can lay their hands on the markets for on supplies of inputs, and particularly the supplies of the materials that are to be found in very few countries. And the other thing that you can see in these countries is that the investment they make as part of the gross domestic product has increased dramatically. So they are essentially they are essentially saving a chunk of their output. They're investing it. They are increasing the output. They're increasing the share, and this is of course a virtuous circle. But nonetheless, when you look at the data for all the countries of the world, there are still a large number of countries dependent on the export of primary commodities. They have pretty much nothing else. And a lot of if they have manufacturing industry, it's manufacturing for the home market. But again, that was something that in the 1970s and 1980s, the World Bank and the IMF, under their structural adjustment programs, tried very hard to prevent countries investing in manufacturing for the domestic market. Because they argued that if you can't compete in the world market, you shouldn't be doing it. You shouldn't be doing it. And of course, there is none of this idea, which I think, had it been followed back in the 60s and 70s, might have had a different outcome, which is once you start manufacturing, you learn. And even if you're heavily dependent on imports for the manufacturing process, you're still learning about manufacturing. And your employees are learning about manufacturing. And your whatever skilled workforce you have is learning about that. And that's how other countries did it. They just learned about manufacturing and then did it. So this is, anyway, this is, and there you have, I see more visual aids, there you have, again it looks a bit like the map of the global north and global south. The more purple it is, the more the country is dependent on primary products. And even Australia is in there, because Australia has quite a big, strong mineral wealth. So, and you see North America doesn't have that. You see Western Europe and the UK, and of course increasingly the yellow to the right of the screen, China and India.
Wait, so what's the purple and what's the yellow?
The purple is the increasing purple is increasing dependence. So if you look at actually look at the key at the bottom, if you can read it from there, as you move from left to right, you move from yellow to purple, and the first purple you come to is 60 to 80% dependent. The second purple on the far right is 80 to 100% dependent.
But also purple produce essential ingredients.
Well, absolutely.
Exactly.
All the minerals you need are to be found mainly in the global south. I mean, of course, one of the biggest oil producers in the world is the United States. Everybody forgets that. They're not exporters, but they're big producers. And I can always remember in 1973 when the oil price went up, and everybody thought this is great for the oil producing countries. What people forgot was it was great for the United States, because it meant that some of their oil deposits that were uneconomic to access suddenly became economic to access, and their output could go up. So yeah, but I mean, looking across Africa, you can see pretty much the whole of Africa is dependent, even South Africa. Because those countries in the south, of course, they have diamonds, they have gold, they have, it's not just South Africa, but Botswana, they're kind of rich in minerals. And so is much of Eastern Europe. One of the important ingredients, I've forgotten what it is now, I'll forget it. It's, one of the important ingredients for batteries is cobalt.
Cobalt.
And cobalt is found principally in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where there's a war going on. But they're still producing cobalt. Ukraine has something, and I've forgotten what it is. I wrote about it, and I forgot what it is. Ukraine has one of the precious metals that goes into batteries. But I don't think that's the reason the Russians invaded. Anyway, so this is where we are. And you find very few countries of the global south, if any, that are, apart from China and India, and the countries around, Vietnam, a lot of those countries, Indochina and Chinese countries, are exporting a lot of manufactured products. And again, when you go shopping, you see.
Peter, I think this map maybe needs to update it, because especially with the new technology, all the hybrid cars, environmental items, military technology, they need rare earth metals.
Sure.
And more than 90% of them are in China.
Yeah.
So, but of course, China is not exporting them. Maybe the map is.
Can I ask you a question?
Can I?
It's not showing the global market though, which is where it's from, so it's quite confusing because you sort of, it's the other way around from this.
Well, it's actually showing the dependency of the global south countries on the export of primary commodities.
So what it's not saying is that the countries in yellow,
The ones buying it.
they're not necessarily the ones buying it, and also that doesn't mean that they also don't have primary commodities.
Yeah.
They may have them, it's just that as a
But they are
percentage,
using
as
themselves.
a percentage of their
China and India are buying them, definitely. North America, definitely. And other countries, of course. I mean, I would imagine that it must be the case that some of the South American countries are buying the commodities that they don't have. This is 2021, by the way.
But if you look at that map,
I don't know how I update it.
it's just collected.
No, I think just because China has so much things, but
Yes.
they are not selling them. They need all of them for
Yes,
themselves.
that's-
And just like American oil,
Yeah.
but they use.
Well, China is now pretty much a developed country. It's not entirely, because it still has a very large, quite kind of significant section of the population that's living on or below the poverty line. I think the last time I looked, and that'll be a little bit dated, it was about 300 million. But it may be lower than that now.
I think just under 10% now, as far as I remember.
So that would be about
Of the population.
130
Yes.
million, yeah.
Under 10% under what?
Of their population living under the
Is living under the poverty line. But even those living on the poverty line or just above it are relatively poor. So, and that really is to do with, I mean, the eastern coast of China is where a lot of the development is, and where a lot of the wealth is. But they're obviously trying to spread it around a bit. Yeah, anyway. And this is by different groups of commodities. So the blue is energy, oil, so on. The green is agriculture, not surprisingly. And the red is minerals, ores and metals. And that's what Australia has. Australia has, I can't remember what they are now, but they've got a lot of precious metals. And parts of Africa, obviously, and bits of what looks to me like maybe China.
The blue, you mean?
Or is it? I don't know what that is. I don't know where that is. But the blue is again of course, export of oil from Russia, export of oil from North Africa, and other parts of Africa, Angola, that blue down on the southwest, and even they've got oil in Tanzania now. So yeah, and oil in Uganda.
Yellow
The yellow is
non-commodity dependent.
they're not dependent. These were the other yellows from the previous. They're not dependent at all on. Well, when I say not dependent, it means that it's less than 40%. So if you're 40% plus, then you are a little dependent. Maybe if you go from 60 to 80, you are dependent. And 80 to 100, you're definitely dependent. So that's the way it goes. Okay, so how long have I got? Not long.
5 minutes?
But we started late.
Or 10 minutes, okay.
Anyway, so I'll just go through these as usual. Like all bad lectures, I have too many slides, but no, I don't have that many more. So I want to put this in the context of the state of capitalist imperialism today. So, and I've written about this in your journal, but the most important element, I think, of what we're seeing in capitalist imperialism today is two things. One is that essentially the control of world capital, of global capital, is in the hands of very few. very large and mainly financial corporations. This doesn't mean to say they own all the capital, it's a question of control. So if you've got shares in, if you're a big bank, and actually when these Swiss people did a particular study which came out with this data, they had Barclays Bank at the top. But what does that mean actually? Well, that means that their financing and their shareholding is critical for the operation of the company. They control, even if they only have a small percentage, they have some degree of control. And of course what we know is that corporates increasingly are having to respond to financial pressures. And pressures, not the financial pressure that comes with not having any, but the financial pressure that is about making as much surplus as you can. So the pressure to maximise profit, and of course in the financial markets the rates of return are huge. You know, 30, 40, 50, 60, 100%. You know, people make these gains in a very short space of time, so you can imagine that puts the pressure on. That's the benchmark, becomes the benchmark about performance. So you have to perform to the standards that are set essentially in financial markets. Well, and financial markets are just another form of very clever betting. And you put your money on something and you get this huge return. So, of course, it can work the other way, as it did in 2008. But when it's going good, so these financial corporates, mainly financial corporates, are in big control of global capital. And one of the things that means is that they have a huge influence on the state in the different countries. So the power of the corporates and those that are not as big as them but big enough, the power of all those corporations, of the global corporates, or as a friend of mine liked to put it, the empire of capital, is huge. And of course it means that governments in countries that are trying to get some control over their own economies can't do that because global capital is in control, and they're in control in all sorts of ways, but in particular by capturing the state. And the state, this business of state capture, which I didn't want to go into in huge detail, but I thought I would mention, is very important in preventing individual countries and individual governments from doing what they might want to do ideologically. Now there are exceptions to this kind of, the business of, for instance, there are lots of economies being at the lower end of the value chains. And the idea that you have these global value chains, that some countries are supplying the basic materials, so they're at the bottom of the chain, if you like, or at one end of the chain, and other countries are picking up value added along the way. And there are exceptions. And of course we know the exceptions. We know about Taiwan, we know about South Korea, we know about China, and some of the other so-called newly industrializing countries. Indeed, there are the BRICS. They're so-called BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Are the ones, and they want to add more. The BRICS are talking about inviting more countries into the club.
They won't accept several more.
Yes, and so of course this is where the combined and uneven development comes in, because you've got now groups of countries that are off on a different path. And one of the stories that is told about those kind of countries is that what they've done is to develop is to have and pursue a developmental state strategy. The state is very active in development, it's very active in getting companies together to organise production, to help companies produce, help the private sector, but in return for very well-disciplined production. Holding people to contracts, holding companies to contracts, not allowing companies to get away with not doing what they were contracted to do. So strict supervision by the state of the companies. And this is roughly what is supposed to have happened in countries like Korea and Taiwan. And of course in China. China has a very strong state. Communist Party-led state, which for a long time didn't let foreign investment in, for a long time didn't allow the development of a domestic capitalist class, and decided with the reforms of the 90s that they would do that, but under very strict control. So that's another development that has happened. And then we look at the tension that develops between global capital, global corporate capital, and some aspects of domestic capital. And this was played out, I think, in the whole Brexit story, because when you look at the Brexit story, when you look at a lot of the high-end supporters of Brexit, a lot of the companies and corporations that supported Brexit, these were domestic corporations that, although they had lots of foreign investment, they also had difficulties with the financial corporations that they had to deal with. And so they were very much in favour of a strong domestic capitalism, even if that was a capitalism that operated outside of the UK. So companies like, I'll think of them in a minute, but there's one that operates not far from us in Kiel. What's it called?
Bet365.
No, not Bet365. It's actually a manufacturing company.
Oh yeah, JCB.
It's JCB. JCB was very strongly pro-Brexit, and yet 60% of JCB's production is in the Far East. It's based in the Far East. So, but that was also the thing. They didn't like Europe. You know, let's go to the Far East. We can do much better in the rest of the world. And that was the case also with the guy, the vacuum cleaner guy. Dyson, yeah. And people like that. Relatively small capitalists that compared to the large corporates. Well, and labour, we know about labour. We know that back in the 19th century, labour was highly mobile and capital wasn't. And now we have a situation where capital is very mobile, and there are attempts to control the mobility of labour across borders. And it's a very different story from the one in the previous century. And then I just wanted to say something about, again, to go back to inequality, and just to summarise, because of the time, all this is to say that we've got increasing inequality between countries. And within countries, we've got increasing inequality. So here's the inequality between countries. So when I looked at in 2022, the highest per capita income country was Monaco, and the lowest was Burundi. And even if you take tax havens out, then Norway 420 times Burundi. And even if you take the purchasing power parity measure, I mentioned earlier, it's 160 times, and that's huge, huge difference in per capita income. And if you remember that, if you think that per capita income is just an average, if you think about distribution, you think how poor the poor of the poor countries are. And it's the distribution is heavily skewed to countries at the lower end. So there you have it. Most of the countries are. So the axis on the left is the vertical axis is the number of countries, and on the right is the per capita income range. And you see, and it goes from high to low. So from left to right is $75,000 down to whatever it is that wasn't there, 1,000. Greater than, less than 1,000, less than $1,000 a year. And there are quite a number of countries in that. So most countries are in those bottom two ranges. And then if we look at just the distribution within countries, this is getting a bit technical now, but there is something called the Gini coefficient, or the Gini index, which measures inequality, which actually measures distribution. And the higher the Gini, the higher the inequality. The higher the index, the higher the inequality. So you see that, I haven't got all the countries in here, but the Slovak Republic is the most equal. 0 would give you complete equality. Everybody would have the same. And as you can see, that of course it doesn't happen. And I don't know if it shows up better on the screen. It does. Sorry?
Zambia.
So Zambia is the most unequal. I think there's even one above Zambia actually. But unfortunately, I couldn't get them all on.
Costa Rica, Paraguay, Mexico.
Yeah, Zimbabwe, of course, you would expect to find out there somewhere. Very unequal. I mean, there we're talking about, you know, a layer of the population that is very rich, and the bulk of the population that is relatively poor, or very poor, and so on. So there we go. Anyway, very quickly to go to futures. I think this is could be my last slide. So then we come back to the old question: is capitalism sowing the seeds of its own destruction? You know, that's a good old question for lefties, and especially for Marxist lefties. What is happening to capitalism? And there's some very good arguments that you'll find, especially in the literature, of ways in which capitalism is developing in a way that is going to result in leaving, it's impoverishing a larger portion of the population, even if that's a relative impoverishment, and not an absolute impoverishment, but it's still impoverishing. I mean, look what's happening now, even in this country, or especially in this country. You have an increasing impoverishment of the poor, and you have a lot of people beginning to drop into that category. Even people on so-called middle incomes are finding it very hard, and find their income in real terms falling. So there's something going on there. Now, and of course, if people can't sell the goods they're producing, then they can't realise their profit. And so this is a problem. And then there are a lot of, there's a guy called Paul Mason who wrote a book on the future of capitalism.
Post-capitalism.
Paul Mason.
Post-capitalism.
Post-capitalism. Which again was raising all these issues about the proliferation of free goods. And he was thinking of things like...
How can you take him seriously?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the main problem with his book, which I thought was that, well, okay, that's all right for the highly developed countries, but it's not. But the rest of, what about the rest of the world? They're not in that situation. So I think one of the ways in which these problems get resolved is going to be either through a shorter, because with AI and with increasing, with all the electronics and the technology we have, what is not happening, which I would have expected to have happened by now, is a big reduction in the working week. Because if you think historically, there have been massive reductions in the working week but it stopped. And so there's a one of the ways in which this might get resolved is through a shorter working week and massive leaps in productivity because of new technologies, and especially because of AI. What also may be forced on countries, and that will make a big difference to the system, is basic income. The pressure to have basic income. And of course, what also you can see likely to happen is a move of the old manufacturing to the global south. So even China is moving some of its manufacturing, particularly things like textiles. It's moving that to parts of Africa or Middle East, because it's moving into the high-tech stuff, and it doesn't want to do the high-tech stuff.
There's also labour in China, apparently. It's like quite,
yeah, and also the cost of labour increasing, that's right. So there's cheaper labour elsewhere, but of course we know what happens then. And we know that people do go on strike in global south countries, and they get high wages. So it's a question of how long this process is going to take. Certainly not in my lifetime. And the other things, and then of course the global context is we have a climate emergency. We have a massive change in weather patterns, which could bring disaster to large parts of the global south. I mean, even now, chunks of Africa in drought. In South Africa, I think now. And so on. So and clearly there are issues with climate. Clearly the whole issue of global warming. There are clearly environmental issues, and things that need to be done. Now, green technology, for example, solar power, favours the global south more than just the global north. So there's a potential for energy production and also to do something about water supply.
To do what about water supply?
Well, that's of course interesting issue about distribution of water, because again, this is going to have to be looked at a world level rather than just a
Can I tell you just very
continent.
quickly climate change?
Sorry?
So Dubai has been shipping
Yes.
blocks of. Have you heard of this? I only found out this recently.
But they have a plan to drag like an Everest-sized iceberg from wherever it was.
Because it's law of the high seas doesn't belong to anybody. That's going to just increase.
Well, yeah, and where's that iceberg coming from? Yeah. So what's happening to the poles? That is very important, and I mean, there are obviously other ways. You can think about global, you can think about a system of global water distribution, because there are countries that have huge surpluses of water. We live in one, even though that's not managed very well. And of course, then finally, the classic way to solve all these problems is to have a war. And I'm afraid to say that it's not looking good on that front. So yeah, so let me finish with Lenin, quoting Napoleon. But also there are issues I raised on that slide about, for example, how do we get socialism? Because it's not looking good. And it's not looking good because nationalisms have come back. And building working class alliances across, and working class defined much more broadly than before, building working class alliances across countries is very hard. Deflating nationalism is very hard. And this looks at the moment extraordinarily utopian. Anyway, the same friend of mine who wrote a lot about Empire of Capital, in one of his books he quotes, he has Lenin quoting Napoleon. I didn't even know that. In French, of course. And I think roughly translated is, well, we struggle, or we try, we work, and then we see. And so, you know, so I suppose we just have to continue. As he would say, the struggle continues.
Now, as usual, let's have a short break again for extra drinks,
Oh, you have a short break?
toilet, and then in about 5 to 10 minutes we will start
Okay.
questions. And start. Any questions, comments? Anything you want to ask about the talk?
Inequality situation in China.
Would you like to hear about that?
No.
About what situation?
Inequality in China.
And then also, I guess, like, you know, there's a big question around this idea, you know, like China, is China socialist, is China not? Sure. And obviously there are capitalist relations of production there. But there are a lot of people of the Stalinist persuasion who will say that China, just the relationship between capital and the state in China is not quite what it is in the capitalist West. And they will cite, for example, the example of Jack Ma, the Alibaba guy, who was about to float his company on the market with what would have been the biggest IPO ever. It's going to be like the Chinese state said, hang on a second,
Sure.
we're not letting anybody
No,
go
no,
on
that's
the
right. Yeah.
Right, it's the kind of thing that, you know, you could never really imagine happening in
America.
in America, right? So there's a different, slightly different relationship between capital and the state.
There are limits. I think this is the thing. They've clearly, they're able to enforce limits, and nobody is objecting, as far as we can make out. There isn't a band of property owners in China acting behind the scenes to get rid of the big guys. So no, I totally agree that it's a different system, and that's the point, that it's a different system, but it doesn't make it socialist. And it raises the whole question about what did that mean in the context of you know, if you go back to the Soviet Union, or you know, what did it actually mean? And of course there was this whole argument that, well, these are all state capitalist countries. But they weren't that either. There were issues around, there were issues around the political class and privileges, but not really about distribution. And the thing about Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, well, Eastern Europe I know a bit better, is that nobody was homeless. Everybody had somewhere to live. They made sure of that. And that meant that people who might have wanted more space didn't get it. But it meant that people who had no space, or might have had no space, got some space. And that seems to me to be very different from a kind of standard capitalist free-for-all, or even administratively, as we had back in the 50s and 60s, capitalisms that were, to some extent, administered out the inequalities, found ways of dealing with that, which clearly doesn't happen now. But also in China, you have people who are extremely rich. I find it totally astonishing that Chinese families are able to send their children for an education at whatever the fee is now for overseas students, even for a whole 3 years or 4 years, I find that extraordinary that they have that level of income. And there is a story that a lot of it is funded by borrowing, and that, you know, people have been saying this for years now, the Chinese financial system is on the edge of collapsing, but it somehow hasn't. And I can't believe the state would step in and prevent it happening. So yeah. But the question is, are they moving in a socialist direction? And where does that come? And it goes back to the old question of transition from one system to another. And when you look at what happened, you know, the only history we have is the history of transition from feudalism to capitalism, and that's a very European story. It's not a global South story. And when you look at feudalism to capitalism, we haven't, even in this country, we haven't yet finished with feudalism.
There was also in Russia and in China.
Yeah,
there was also a transition to.
That's right.
To something else.
And they had feudalism, and they moved from feudalism to a state socialism, I think, is what you would call it, probably.
And also, you didn't read the fall of the Berlin Wall and that whole. I was thinking that might have changed some of the conclusions at the end. You know, we were talking about comparisons.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, China is really, if you look at China, in terms of socialism, China is the only success story that started out as ideologically a socialist system and would claim still to be a socialist system.
Even there's a website I read sometimes called RedSales.org, which is run by a guy who believes that China is socialist, and he says there's quotes from the CIA as to Xi Jinping, and apparently people in the CIA have described him as redder than red, and he himself, if you read what he writes, I don't think the guy's pretending to be a Marxist. Really, I don't think ideologically the guy he's sitting there thinking I've just pulled the wool over everyone's eyes. Like he believes he's a Marxist. He believes that he's on the path to socialism, and that what he says is that actually we are now, we're developing the means of production as Marx said we should. There's a market and there's all of that, but this is going to lead us to that.
I agree with Peter that China is a different category. I was in 2018 in a conference in Beijing, in Peking University. I was telling you earlier, and there was this main session of the whole conference participated by David Harvey, Samir Amin, and one Chinese professor who was advising the Xi Jinping, and he was also a very important person in modern Chinese history. He was the first person escaped from Taiwan when he was doing his military service. He was born in Taiwan, and during his military service, he swam from Taiwan to China. And then China adopted him, and he was the first person, Chinese person, China sent him to do his PhD in America. So he was a very well-informed professor of economics. So those three were discussing exactly this topic. What is Chinese? And that conference was so open conference, like all those people asking questions whether China capitalist, state capitalist, and I always remember what David Harvey said. David Harvey said, I don't really care what you call it, but what is happening in China now is very significant, he said, because Soviet Union was an experiment, and they tried something which failed, but here there is another experiment going on, and so far with success. So many people moved from below poverty line, below really desperation to middle class level, and this process is continuing. And in that sense, David Harvey said, I wouldn't even call it state socialism, state capitalism, or this or that. Just this experiment so far is going in the right direction. And then he said one thing. He said, for me, the main reason why it is going securely is because you didn't open your financial side to the global economy, global finance. He said, just keep it under your control. You can enter into any kind of economic relations, but not with the finance, because then you will be open to all the pressures from the global finance, and you cannot continue as the owner of this experiment. I think you also told me some other time that this financial aspect is so important.
Yeah. No, that's right. I agree.
Imran, yes?
Okay. I'm so happy to be in this seminar because it gives a lot of structure to discuss and to proceed from there. I think the major issue is exactly what you said. One mode of production to another, the passage is what our knowledge is very limited. I studied social anthropology. It opened my eyes. Because we are speaking about society, state, whether there is a state or stateless, or etc. So it gave me more idea what can I think about, what I look at it. Even in my own country, which I'm living here in Britain for 52 years now, but I'm speaking about 50 years ago.
Sure.
When I went to the eastern part of Turkey, for 18 days stayed there with the family, when my husband was doing the armyship,
For military service.
Service, that's 2 years there.
That's good.
So I see that the difference between their living and our living. Okay, family was quite well off. However, attitude was very different. For example, a child fell down, their own child, and they immediately take it to the breast and suck the breast, 5-year-old child. I was amazed because I have learned from my mother 1 year is enough, you know. But they are giving them the support, etc. And then I also read in somewhere that in Chinese, very old time, in Chinese high level of people, especially the people who were going to be the Çinlilerin başında şey yapanlar ne denirdi eskiden? Chinese Han, değil mi?
Oh, the Han. Yeah.
Han. They were giving this sucking 8 years. When the child cut off from breastfeeding, the child was really like in coma and slowly crying. So it was the one of my life, my mother, etc.
Just in
so
China.
I'm trying to link them up. But I see
Very interesting combination.
my son was about 2.5, 3 years old. He said to me, I don't want to go back. He wanted to live in the house, among the other children. I felt exactly the same. It was because these families opened a house for us. Their husband, I mean, 2 brothers. The one brother was in Izmir and having the armyship. Their houses opened, which is very rare because my husband is a male and the woman who's not widow but living alone, they shouldn't really take the male in, but they loved us and they want us to stay there. extent of the relationship is completely different. So I'm going to stop this here. But what I'm trying to say, when we are speaking about whether moving from capitalism to socialism is not a simple thing, because exactly what you said, our understanding of transition from one mode of production to another is very limited. Our understanding is very limited and very Western-oriented. For example, when I'm hearing about China, reading about China, I immediately think of the middle class, and my hairs is turning up, because I know what the middle class is, and how harmful they are, how greedy they are. They become more and more and more greedy. So any country, any discussion, they are always speaking about the previous mode of production things. Maybe it was okay up to now, because feudalism, let's say the limited understanding, feudalism moved to capitalism. More or less the same things. Okay, there was people who were a king, queen, Han or whatever, and they are exactly the same because there is a state. Whereas when we are speaking about communism, we are speaking about no state. There is a completely different phenomenon. We need to look into it, and it is very different, completely different. One person dared to do the theory, which is Eugeni Brunschla-Poshikanis, and during the Stalin time, he's exterminated. Nobody knows what happened to him, and he's 1953. He's given the honorary scholarship, but he was dead, or nobody does know what happened to him. He's the one that he writes about theory of materialist theory of state, and he's very clear in there. There is no state.
Maybe Peter should respond now.
Exactly. I will finish, but okay. I want to clarify what I am trying to think. So, the new state, we can't look at, not the stage, we can't look at the existing terminology, existing concepts, because we are speaking about war. It was always like that. You take some people's land, utilize it, and it is yours. Whether it's Ottoman, whether it's an Iranian empire, whether this, whether that.
So because there are plenty of things you mentioned, yeah, but I am scared that he may forget what you told before.
No. I mean, I'm just completely. Okay. I mean, it is very difficult for me to bring them. Okay. The most important thing is to understand how, as a human being, defining ourselves, because when I look at the past, whatever our attitude and understanding is all made up, is nothing like I can say, that's my nature. No, I'm sorry, it's not nature, it's learned things. Very small percentages is the nature. You can say, yes, as a human nature is like that. But, oh, human nature is egoist and this and that. There are not.
Okay, sorry, because there will be no time left for anybody else. Okay.
Okay.
Peter.
I mean, all I want to, I will ask the question, is there a possibility? Like, for example, these days, people were speaking about the egalite.
Just one question.
Egalite is something that in sociology is not bring out and theorized. So now, recently, there's an attempt to discuss about egalite. What is it? And make it a big issue and look at from that angle. I'm not saying that it's the only thing, but it is an important step. So how do you see that we will proceed from there, start to develop things like, for example, war? What rights you have?
Yeah. I mean, I get that. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it's very
I think
difficult
this transition story is really about contradictions and how contradictions get resolved. So it doesn't matter what pre-existing society you have, there are always going to be contradictions in those societies' developments. I mean, for example, this is now an African example, you know, the kind of view of African rural society was, well, it was full of small farmers, small families with family farms, with some kind of communalism. So land was allocated according to need and by the chief, and so on. And of course, what happens out of that is that you start a process in which some people can manage the land and other people can't. They start to employ labour, even on a casual basis or on a friendly family exchange basis. Things start to change. And they start to change because of material conditions. So I mean, and then you have to identify those changes and make some judgment as to where that is likely to go. Well, we've actually seen where it goes. It goes into some people accumulating, and other people not. It goes into some people becoming large landowners, and other people becoming landless workers. And we know how that goes. And at some point, that system, obviously you can say it can develop further. And one of the interesting things in looking at development is, where does an industrializing bourgeoisie come from? And sometimes it comes from agricultural bourgeoisie. It gets involved in enterprise and manufacturing. But increasingly, given the nature of the world, it's going to come from some deal with a developed country corporate, and then there's going to be accumulation on the back of that. So, and all sorts of things are possible. The thing we have to do is to kind of monitor that and look at and analyse that in the context of accumulation and development. And I think that the issue of socialism has to be about when capitalism reaches a limit, reaches a point where its contradictions are so strong that it breaks down. Now, I can see that happening with the development of financial capitalism the way it's developed now, although we always have financial capitalism. But I can see that developing in the sense that it's not about products, it's about creaming off surplus for the benefit of the financial sector. And this can only lead to a breakdown in the system. And we saw a bit of it in 2008. But it would happen on a much bigger scale. Because at some point, it will be impossible for manufacturing to be successful. There'll be limits. If people are going to become increasingly impoverished, there will be limits to markets and to people's ability to buy. And once that happens, then how are corporates going to accumulate? So it's a huge contradiction. So they have to do something about that. And that's going to happen. It's got to happen.
Nathan, your question, your comment.
All I would say is, like, do you know David Graeber?
Yes.
It sounds like you might enjoy some of what he writes
Yes.
about.
Yes, he's really good at that.
Yeah, because he talks about, like, you know,
I'm shocked
also,
that he's dead now.
yeah, it was very shocking. But he's also an anthropologist, and he's into
Yes.
like micro-level transitions between. I disagree with some of what he's talking
Yeah,
about,
but
but it's interesting.
He's an anarchist.
He's an anarchist. Yeah. But he also kind of has a view of, like, he basically says that human history is just kind of pretty random. Some people were like fishing, some people were farming, these guys were like having parties, and those guys or whatever. He doesn't pay attention to material conditions and the way that they determine these things. But interesting, sounds like you might enjoy it. I enjoy it.
Yes.
That's one thing, but yeah, on the other point, so you, like, a lot of what we're talking about here is, if you looked at your penultimate slide,
Yeah.
there was, I think, a phrase that you used was, "Is capitalism sowing the seeds of its own destruction?" And there's a very kind of deterministic and structural focus to that, of saying, well, you know what, the economy, you know, it tends towards crisis. It's always tended towards crisis. As far back 200 years ago, it's been tending towards crisis. And we've all been predicting the downfall of capitalism
For a long time, yes.
since the day that it came, right? And then it's not really materialised. And I think the main reason is that the real solution lies not in the economic realm, but in the political realm. And that's especially true, I think, in the Western world, right? So the responsibility to bring about a different system, given the, as we've discussed, the combined and uneven development that exists on Earth, is actually on the shoulders of people in the West, right? Because we are hegemonic over a country like that I study, like Iraq. Iraq has no sovereignty. It has no ability to make decisions for its own population, right? It's completely subservient to the global market. I mean, it's 98% of its GDP is oil, and even if it wasn't, like other neighbouring countries you don't have oil, like Syria and the rest of them, their policy is either a reaction to Western policy or determined by Western policy. Right? So that's all to say that, and we're at, I think, a stage I think it's fair to say, in the Western world, where the development of the means of production has reached a stage where we can supply the needs of everybody living, right, with food, housing, shelter, and the basic necessities of life. So the question is no longer one of the economy. Well, we need to develop this and we need to develop that. We're there, right? We just need to redistribute the stuff. And the way to do that, and not just redistribute the stuff, we need to inculcate a certain way of living, as you were saying, right? Which is also deeply relates to education and ideology and moral values and all of those things. So the question, therefore, is not, was capitalism sowing the seeds of its own destruction, but rather, what is being done politically? You know, this so-called famous subjective fact, right? That's lacking. It's always been lacking. So, yeah, I mean, I can go on, but that's the point I want.
No, I mean, I think this whole, because clearly nothing is as mechanistic as the move through these modes of production. Not like that at all, but it is okay. We see it now politically in terms of the resurgence of populism and the way it can be manipulated by smart politicians. And these are largely based on, and as we know, a lot of this is based on human emotion. So Brexit is a perfect example of that. It had nothing to do with anything other than the way people were feeling at the time, and how emotional they were attached or not attached. And so you can't. So these kind of things that were always put by Marxists into the superstructure are really, actually, clearly interacting with the base very heavily, and should be taken into account. I totally agree with that. But I'm kind of looking for. I mean, you see there are a lot of question marks on that slide because because in theory there comes a point when capitalism can't do it anymore, and I think we're a long way from that. We're a long way from that because what is the limit to the development of productive forces? And as we can see, we're now entering a new era with artificial intelligence, which is going to be able to do all kinds of amazing things. Probably not as many as are anticipated by people who write about it. I doubt very much whether all that kind of stuff is actually going to happen. But a lot of kind of things that are going to reduce drudgery are going to happen. But this is only going to happen in this part of the world.
Or it might not, because like you were saying, it's
Or it might not.
a social change.
No, it might not. But at least it's all, all of that is happening in the global north. And so there has to be reasons why the global north, why the corporates are going to want to pursue this in the global south. Or there are going to be movements within the global south which are going to demand it and are going to follow the path of the Koreas and even China in this way. So, but there's no point trying to predict what's going to happen. It's just what the tendencies are, and I think the tendencies within capitalism are that although there seems to be no limit to what capitalism can do technologically, at some point there must be, there probably will be.
But I think on that question, like the quotation you mentioned, capitalism sowing seeds, sowing destruction. Someone called Peter Dicken, he was a political economy professor, was in Manchester University, and he has a book called Global Shift.
Yes.
Which now has 7th print from like last 10 years. Every year prints a new one. And he says something, I think it's also based on one quotation from Marx, which kind of implies that this will continue still for a significant period. Because the reason why things are moving one country to another is basically based on what you described in your presentation. Now there is a capital. Capital is global, and capital has no nation, no color, no identity, and doesn't stop at the borders. So therefore, what capital was just one simple thing: tries to achieve the highest rate of profit wherever and whenever and however it is possible. If it is not possible in this location, moves to another location. That's why things are moving now from China to Africa to other countries. So this can still continue for a very, very long time. So unfortunately, I want capitalism to come to an end, but I don't think it will be at the horizon for many, many years.
I think, again, because, sorry, it's something you want to go.
Go on, of course.
I was just saying, capitalism, neoliberalism, for example, is a political movement.
Yes.
Right? There's institutions and there's ideologies and there's ideologues and there's businessmen and politicians, and they've built a massive global movement that's based on, very flimsy ideology that we know doesn't pan out in the real world. So it's the same kind of thing, like when we talk about capitalism, it's not something inevitable, it's something constructed, it's socially constructed. So the solution to it is equally something socially constructed. And that replacement, no, we shouldn't be, I don't think, sort of wedded to perfection. Right? Nobody think, it's not utopian, socialism will be a mess. It's the truth. It's not going to be. We're not going to transition to like this kind of perfect. But just in the same way that we've lived with 200 years with the mess of capitalism, like maybe if we were to realign in terms of values politically, then we could produce a kind of slightly better mess. So like, the solution being political. Right? That's to be a bit facetious.
Using everything up.
But you can't exclude, you can't do, the climate breakdown.
Oh God, guys.
Yeah, no, really, seriously. Talk about sowing maybe sowing the seeds of its own destruction capitalism in a very different way from the way Marx talks about it. And it's just simply the degree to which the free-for-all, not even really under control. There are all sorts of resolutions and agreements and deals that are supposed to be done, but we continue to raise the temperature. And of course the climate emergency is going to lead. I mean, one kind of dystopian vision of it is you're going to have a large proportion of the world's population living in water scarce, continued drought conditions. They're going to want to migrate. And where are they going to migrate to?
It's already started.
And it's already started.
Yeah.
Exactly so. So they, you know, and what's that going to do to the system?
Open the borders.
Yeah, and if you do that, well.
Well, guys,
Anyway.
I have to cut this
Yes.
amazing discussion because we already passed the time given to us. Now the building person will come and tell us.
Oh, really? Okay.
Because 8:30 is our limit. So when we are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for providing such a